Well, welcome to episode 119 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And today I'm going to talk about Moby Grape's debut album from 1967 entitled Moby Grape. And what I have here is a 1967 reissue which has a number of notable changes to the cover, including the fact that Don Stevenson's middle finger, which was extended in the original photograph, is airbrushed out. And also the flag behind Skip Spence here, which is actually an American flag in the original photograph, has been blacked out as well, and more on that later on. This album is considered one of the highlights of the Haight-Ashbury scene, of the psychedelic scene in San Francisco. It's often said to be a psychedelic masterpiece, but the irony is that it's not actually that psychedelic a record. For the most part, this is an album full of straight-ahead rock and roll, full of 3-minute pop songs. All 5 members of the group sing, and all 5 members of the group also write songs. It's diverse and it's interesting. But the question for any reviewer is this actually worth the hype? Rolling Stone says this is the 121st best album of any kind in history. We'll see. Moby Grape were formed in 1966 in San Francisco by Canadian musician Skip Spence. Spence was from Windsor, Ontario. He'd moved down to California, and he was then recruited into the Jefferson Airplane by Marty Balin. But he was fired by the Jefferson Airplane for going AWOL on a holiday down to Mexico, as was the then manager of the Jefferson Airplane, a guy called Matthew Cates. And Cates encourages Spence to form his own band, very much along the lines of the Airplane. Spence had been the drummer in the Airplane, but he decided to move to guitar in forming this new band. For a drummer, they brought in Don Stevenson, who had been with the Frantics, who were a Seattle band who'd moved to San Francisco. They also brought in the second guitarist, also from the Frantics, a guy called Jerry Miller. A third member of the Frantics, a guy called Bob Mosley, had been the bass player and had subsequently been with the Misfits, but was recruited now to join Moby Grape. And the lineup for the Grape was completed by adding a third guitarist, Peter Lewis, who had been with the Cornells. Although they bore a lot of similarities to the sound in San Francisco at the time, their musical output was a bit distinct. They resisted the general trend in the San Francisco scene towards much longer jams, think the Grateful Dead, and actually focused much more on tighter pop songs. They began gigging in early '67. Soon they were playing with the Dead, they were playing with Big Brother and the Holding Company, who of course are Janis Joplin's group, and a bidding war soon emerges between 2 different record labels, Columbia and Elektra, as to who would actually get to sign them. Eventually the band goes with Columbia because Columbia's producer, David Rubinson, promised them that as part of taking them on board, they would get rid of Cates, the manager, who was a weird and divisive character. That never came to pass, and that would actually be quite significant. They soon go into the studio and record this debut. So far so good, but from there it was all kind of bad luck and controversy. First, there were issues with the album cover. Stevenson's finger has to get airbrushed out by the record company in later releases, and Columbia also started to get lots of heat from veterans groups because these guys were posing with an American flag, and it was seen to be inappropriate to have hippies posing with an American flag. So first, Columbia colored it all red, and that was a problem because people felt, well, hang on, maybe these guys are actually communist. The third version is in fact this version here with the black flag. But there were other problems at the time. The record release party was a bit of a disaster. They dropped all these purple orchids all over the floor, which caused people to slip and fall. They had a whole bunch of wine, but there were no corkscrews to open the wine. Much more problematic was the arrest of 3 band members at the release party for being with underage girls, although those charges were rapidly dropped, I should hasten to add. Columbia then had this brilliant idea to release no fewer than 5 singles from the album all the same day. And unsurprisingly, in all that noise, 3 of those singles failed to chart, and the other 2 did not make much of a dent in the charts at all. The band also had gotten a big break in the summer of 1967 by being invited to play at the Monterey Pop Festival. This, of course, was the one where The Who play, Otis Redding plays, Jimi Hendrix is introduced to an American market and burns his guitar on stage, and so on. However, the band's manager, Matthew Cates, gets hold of the promoter for Monterey Pop. There's a guy called Lou Adler, a producer himself, who would later go on to produce Carole King's work, and asked for an amount which in 1967 was huge money, $1 million. Adler says, go to hell. You're not going to be in the film. And they moved Moby Grape to a very early part of the bill on Friday night when nobody actually sees them. They make no impact. They have no opportunity to be in the film. A big own goal. But despite all of that bad luck, it wasn't actually that which did for the band, which of course was a very talented group of musicians. It was actually mental illness. In 1968, while the band's second album was being recorded in New York, Spence broke into Don Stevenson's hotel room with a fire axe. He ended up being institutionalized, diagnosed with schizophrenia. Eventually, after 6 months, he's released. He rides a motorbike down to Nashville, records his debut solo album. but then almost immediately thereafter relapses into the grip of his disease. The rest of his life is a really sad tale of being in and out of institutions, addictions, failed comebacks, and he dies young at 53. The other band member to suffer from mental illness was the bass player, Bob Mosley, who stuck around for one more album than Spence, but then ran off and joined the Marines, only to be diagnosed with schizophrenia by the Marine Corps. And the band itself, of course, never recovered from these two blows. This album was recorded in Los Angeles in March 1967, and the producer, as I mentioned, was David Rubinson. He, in my view, does not do a particularly good job in this record. The acoustic pieces, I think, sound pretty good, but the harder rocky numbers are, to my ears, a little shallow sounding. It's kind of unfortunate because you got 3 different sounding guitar players, and the number of textures and moods you can get out of that are numerous. But the bigger issue with this album is the duration of the songs. Because of the ill-fated plan to release a whole bunch of singles off the album, Columbia were insisting on keeping things down to 3 minutes. Good ideas start, but they're just nipped in the bud before anything gets a chance to develop. Notwithstanding all that, this album is generally considered to be a huge success. It went to number 24 in the charts. It was a big critics' favorite, as evidenced by Rolling Stone calling it number 121 of the top 500 records of all time, and lots of artists covered and continue to cover songs off this record. The album starts with a song by Stevenson and Miller called Hey Grandma. This song is a bit of a mixture of the classic San Francisco sound, but also it's clearly very influenced by the Beatles. And lyrically, it's all about drugs in the San Francisco scene, dope, speed, cough syrup, you name it. The next song, Mr. Blues, is the first Bob Mosley song, and Mosley's voice is very much a soul voice. He would not at all have been out of place on the Stax Volt records from around the same era. A third different songwriter for a third song, and this is Peter Lewis's Fall on You. Here's an example of a song which never really gets a chance to get going because there are some great glimmers of guitar, but the song ends before it gets to go anywhere. 805, the next song, which is by Stevenson and Miller, who also wrote Hey Grandma, is an album highlight. This has actually been covered by Robert Plant, amongst others. That's followed by Come in the Morning by Bob Mosley, and we're back to that kind of upbeat soul sound. I don't know about everybody else, but to me this song sounds a lot like the Guess Who. The similarities between Mosley and Burton Cummings vocally are pretty striking here. Now we come to Skip Spence's song Omaha, and I think this is the best song on the record. The guitar work on here is great. All 3 players are contributing something very different. Has nothing to do with Omaha, but it doesn't matter. This is an excellent song, one you want to play again and again. Last song on side 1 is a bit of an oddity. It's Naked If I Want To. It's kind of, think of the White Album, some of those little snippety tunes that the Beatles would have that would last about 30 odd seconds. It's a bit of a novelty and a bit of a throwaway. Side 2, I think, starts with a bit of a lowlight, which is Someday. Not a bad song musically, but lyrically, it's just petty, angry, breakup stuff. I think the music deserves something better than the grumpy shit lyrics which it gets saddled with. That's okay, because the next song is Ain't No Use, which is written by Stevenson and Miller, who really are a great songwriting team all the way through this record. And this is basically a bluegrass tune. It's beautiful. Well, really, you could have put it on an album by Poco or Pure Prairie League or the Burritos from around this era, and it would not in any way have seemed out of place. The next song, Sitting by the Window, which was written by Peter Lewis, is another highlight. The singing is not that strong, but the song itself is so well constructed, it just completely sticks in your head. Changes follows by Stevenson and Miller. Lyrically, this song's not really at the races. These guys are not Dylan, and sometimes it shows. This song's actually closer to some of the contributions by Mosley on this album, that upbeat, Stax soul sound. Think, Otis Redding meets Haight-Ashbury. The second last song is Lazy Me, which is by Bob Mosley, and has a melody which I think is strangely close to Wicked Game by Chris Isaak from many years later. Nice little tune, and a bass solo at the end by Mosley, which I was kind of enjoying, but of course, like so many of the songs, it's completely truncated. The closer on the album is Indifference, which is a Skip Spence song, and I think this is one of the strongest songs on the record. It's a drug song. I think it's pretty clearly about acid. Then the band starts to move into a jam, which is kind of exciting and is going places, I think, but unfortunately we never get to find out because the production decision is to wind it all up. To answer the question I posed at the outset, I think this album is actually overrated. Fundamentally, this is a record by a band who had a lot more to offer than their record company was able to realize, and it shows. Everything on this record is solid, including, for the most part, the songwriting, but everything comes to an end too soon. And it's okay to be left wanting more, but unfortunately, we're left wanting a lot more. With Moby Grape, it's a case of what might have been, not just with respect to their own challenges, but with respect to the production choices. But all that considered, it's a 4 out of 5 record.